Morning, everybody. First thing I want to tell you is that I am so excited because this is either the last or the second to last lecture I need to do for this class, hiding in my office like I'm terrified or something like that. We get to go back to class Monday morning, and I am pretty excited about that and hope that more than a few of you share my feelings on that one. So I guess what I'm saying is let's go ahead and we will get as much of this done as I feel like makes pretty good sense before we get back into the classroom. I got one or two lectures on forages that are better served in the classroom and have a little bit of conversation. So here we go. All right, chemical composition of herbage. So this one isn't very long, and this is really a repeat of a lot of the things that you've been hearing about this all along. It is kind of handy to put it up in a different way, and maybe we can drive a little bit different understanding. So the proteins in, let me get rid of that. Okay, the proteins that we're going to find in nitrogen, taken off on sorry, I guess I was blending the lines between another class, but crude protein, you have heard this part for me. It's composed of protein and non-protein nitrogen. So that's why we call it crude protein. We're just running a test for nitrogen. And that test really doesn't even close to fully describe of the nitrogen that it finds. Some of it's going to certainly be associated with a protein or an amino acid at a minimum. And then there's going to be other nitrogen that we find in a feed sample that it isn't necessarily associated with an amino acid. And we're going to call that non-protein nitrogen, or NPN. When you're buying that, NPN is nothing more than urea. It's exactly the same stuff that you'd buy to put on fertilizer, put out as fertilizer on one of your fields. We've been through this before. Ruminants can just pick up that nitrogen, and under certain conditions, they can go ahead and make amino acids with it. When we start looking at the actual proteins, this is going to get dangerously close to getting into an upper level ruminant nutrition class, and I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. So when we're looking at actual proteins that we're going to find in plant material, we can break it into two categories. We've got soluble and non-soluble protein. The soluble proteins are the ones that all the gut bugs are going to do a pretty good job of breaking up those larger proteins themselves. In point of fact, when that happens, a lot of times those little rumen microorganisms, they are consuming those amino acids themselves, or in a lot of instances, they might actually be breaking the amino acids down into like a carbon chain and then NPN themselves. The point being is with a trillion head of gut bugs in that rumen, they are coming into existence and dying all the time. I mean, billions and billions of them a day. Those little microbes themselves have a pretty good charge of protein in them, in and of themselves. When they die, they wind up going right through the rest of the gut like everything else, and it's digestible protein, almost indistinguishable from like if you're getting it out of soybean meal or cottonseed meal or whatever the case may be. The non-soluble proteins, that just means they were non-soluble inside of the gut, or excuse me, inside of the rumen. Those proteins actually wind up going right through the rumen, get passed through the reticulum a couple of times, go through the omasum, and then they wind up in the abomasum, which is just a regular type stomach, and on into the small intestines, which certainly have a whole bunch of pretty cool enzymes there to break proteins down. When you get into a ruminant nutrition class, they might call that rumen escape protein. Yes, it is absolutely true that ruminants need some soluble protein and they need some rumen escape protein to handle the rest of the intestines. I think for this class, that's enough to just understand that there is a difference there. When we go to balance rations, it's really not going to make any difference at all whether we're talking about a rumen bypass protein or not. The only other thing I might add to that is ruminant animals, there is just this kind of hard floor that we can't go through, otherwise everything falls apart. And it's like 6.9% protein. And we need that much just to feed the gut bugs and keep them alive. If we dip below that, the gut bugs start dying off, and then everything kind of goes to hell in the handbasket. So really, that's the biggest things I would hope you'd learn from that. So those soluble proteins and non-protein nitrogen can readily be consumed by the rumen microorganisms, and they get shifted into amino acids, and those are easily absorbed. Everything's cool. The lesser soluble proteins are somewhat consumed and converted into microbial protein. Most of it goes on into the abomasum. And at that point, the protein digestion is almost entirely exactly the same as it would be like in a human body or a hog, something like that. Okay. Next one. So, God, my camera's just killing me today. Some more good rules and information. Most plants, when we're talking about protein and how much they're supplying, when we do that crude protein test on it, it's probably a pretty good bet to say 75% of the nitrogen you get returned on that Kildall test, 75% of it's probably going to be in the form of an amino acid or a protein. So protein. The other 25% is probably going to be that NPN. Really not too much to worry about at that point. That's all fine. That's hunky-dory. As a plant matures, you're going to see more of the nitrogen associated with protein than you will NPN. So it's kind of a younger plant issue that has a whole bunch of nitrogen in it that's not necessarily tied up with the protein. Here is one spot where we do run into some bugaboos, and we talked about this just a little bit the other day. There are over 200 different ways NPN can show up. Or I guess another way to put that, if you want to take the chemistry tack on it, there are 200 naturally occurring nitrogen compounds that may show up in feed. And about 199 of them don't bug us any. There is one we got to worry about, and that's nitrates. So when we do a feed test, it is super, super simple to just add. It's kind of like buying a car. You can add Sirius XM, you can add air conditioning, cruise control, leather seats, all this good stuff. On a feed test, you can just do this as an add-on and look for nitrates. At 0.07% nitrate found in the test, we're going to start poisoning animals a little bit. Probably not much is going to come down with a clinical case of it or, go down with nitrate poisoning. But somewhere between 0.07% and 0.22%, we're going to start causing some serious problems. 0.22% is the LD50 dose, or that's going to kill 50% of the test subjects. Here's the weird thing about it. First of all, an animal, ruminants are going to start actually building antibodies. It's almost like getting vaccinated. They'll start building antibodies against nitrates. I'm sorry, I skipped an important part I should have repeated from the other day is what happens when you've got too much nitrate in the blood. it actually has those nitrates have a higher affinity for oxygen than what your red blood cells do. So the nitrates start stealing all the oxygen out of the blood, and that just won't do when your brain needs lots and lots of oxygen to function. So if you can kind of follow me through how it does wind up poisoning a critter, they actually asphyxiate. But given a little bit of time, those critters are actually going to start building antibodies against nitrates. So the antibodies start plugging up the nitrates that might be floating around in the body, and it becomes less and less of an issue over time. It's just when you introduce nitrates all of a sudden, that we can run into a problem. So not to take too much of your time getting into an animal health class, but the telltale sign of this is you actually get a critter and you cut one of the blood vessels on their tail, and you're wanting to look at what color the blood is. And I kid you not, I have seen this before. If you cut their tail and start looking at that blood is brown, like Hershey syrup brown. And that was the old school fix for it. Some guys would actually just cut their tail off. And what they were trying to do is just almost bleed them to death. What we were doing was trying to dump all the nitrates and get them out of the system. We've got a few little tricks that work a little bit better than that now, so we don't have to cut tails off to fix it anymore. But yeah, a lot of the things that are going to bring this on, this is exactly the discussion we had last lecture, was there are some plants that some metabolic pathway inside of that plant goes haywire. And instead of building amino acids, that plant starts laying down these nitrates in its tissue. Stressing that plant's what brings that on. So it could be a freeze, it could be a drought, it could be too much water, it could be it's just not happy today. There's a lot of things that can bring that on. And the other kind of crazy thing about it is, for example, you might be out grazing some oats or something like that, and one day you got this horrible nitrate problem, and literally 12 hours later, you're fine. Yeah, that one is kind of a bummer. Moving on to the chemical composition of the carbohydrates. I'm going to tell you this is probably the more important part of the discussion. So we're going to split this into two different categories. So we've got the non-structural carbohydrates. To make that super simple for you, that is the fructose, the glucose. That is all the freebie, high energy, easy to get at, super soluble sugars. You would love nothing more than your plants to just be loaded up with those carbohydrates. They take very, very little digestion. They're super quick, energy packed. You get a whole bunch of performance off of that. The first thing I need to say, and you've seen me draw that picture of a thickening cell wall on plant material, that's all the inside part of the cell. We really like it. Everybody wants it all the time, period. The problem is that starts drying up or becomes a decreasing and smaller fraction of what's happening when a plant starts maturing. It is also entirely possible, and I shouldn't leave out the starches. Plants will lay down plenty of starch too, but for all intents and purposes, once it hits the gut, whether it's a starch or a sugar, it really doesn't matter too much. It's all super good. It's all super easy to digest. We do see some other changes in a plant daily, and this kind of makes sense. So at nighttime, plants will send a bunch of sugar down into the roots. And it's there because, I guess, you can't say a plant's instinctive or anything like that, but at nighttime the plant can't do any photosynthesizing, so what it's doing is it's actually doing more repair and growth work on the roots than it will be on the above ground growth. Also, it's those exact same sugars, this is kind of twofold. It's those exact same sugars that allow the plant to make more chlorophyll, so therefore it can do more photosynthesis. So it sends sugar back up into the plant during the day. The other thing is photosynthesis does, in point of fact, create a bunch of sugar. So, of course, that plant's going to have more sugar during the day than it is at night. That's actually going to matter when we start talking about making hay. Yeah. One other little oddity about this is if we are using heavy fertilizer out on a pasture or making hay, whatever the case may be, the more fertilizer you use, you're actually going to reduce the amount of sugar found in that plant. And that makes a little bit of sense. If that plant just isn't having to work very hard to do what it needs to do, it's actually going to get about half lazy on you. Okay. Then we've got the structural carbohydrates, and those are polysaccharides with a bajillion double bonds in it, and it becomes a very hard compound. That's what gives the plant structure. That's what allows grass to grow up tall and hold its leaves out. Mixed up in all of that is plenty of pectic substances. That's actually the glue in between all of those cell walls, and that, if the cells are the actual building blocks, we got to have some sort of mortar to stick the blocks together. Those pectic substances are not very digestible. That's not necessarily helping you as far as nutrition goes. Then you've got your non-cellulosic polymers. So that's going to be a substance that's called hemicellulose. Hemicellulose is just kind of that gray area in between something being a starch, or, not something, a carbohydrate being a starch or being a fiber. Fiber and cellulose, for all intents and purposes, are the same thing. So that hemicellulose, that's something that's kind of halfway in between. For a ruminant animal, hemicellulose is actually pretty digestible. Not quite as good as a starch, but it'll do. Then when we get into cellulose, of course, monogastric animals can do Zippo with that. But back to that trillion head of gut bugs, they make an enzyme. Make sure you understand it's the rumen microorganisms that make it, not the animal, make this enzyme called cellulase. So cellulase is what actually allows that critter to eventually get at some of the energy that's stored inside of fiber. So yeah, the latter two of these, so the hemicellulose and the cellulose, it's resistant to chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion, it helps. It increases surface area and all that good stuff. But it's only enzymatic digestion that's going to do anything with hemicellulose and cellulose. And in point of fact, it's only because of those rumen microorganisms that we even get the correct enzyme. So we've got this inverse relationship between structural and non-structural carbohydrates. If you think about a little tiny wheat plant that's just starting to grow, like today, little tiny plant, got 3, 4, 5 leaves on it, something like that. That is almost all starch and sugar right there, and just a little tiny touch of some of those cellulose compounds in there to give it some structure. As that plant grows and matures, it starts changing, and pretty soon the cellulose just absolutely outpaces everything else. The first part of the plant that's actually going to change there is, and this makes sense, is the stem. So the stem of the plant is going to be almost all super hard structural carbohydrates, or the cellulose fraction of it. It's only the fastest growing parts of the plant that have those really good sugars in them, and coincidentally those really good soluble proteins in them. So you'll hear a bunch of people talk about the best parts of the best plants. Well, that's basically going to boil down to whatever's growing out there And the further away from the crown or the stem of that plant is probably going to have the best nutrition. That stem starts becoming nothing more than a cardboard box. Okay, some of the other good stuff. So lipids, it can go from, plants can be somewhere between 3 and 10% fat. So, as a general rule of thumb, as a plant matures, it's going to have less fat in it. Most of those fatty acids are going to be galactolipids and phospholipids. That's your good cholesterols right there. However, I do want to give you one warning. You've all seen lots of plants, and an aloe plant's a really good example, that have this kind of waxy cover over the top of the leaf. That wax is a fat, there's no doubt about that, but that's an absolutely indigestible one. It's not doing anything to help you. That's gonna come back up again when we start talking about making hay. One thing about that waxy covering on a leaf is it really retains moisture inside of that leaf, and again, we're talking about making hay here. Yeah, when the waxes are disturbed, the problem with that is when we bust up that little covering on the leaf of a plant, a lot of times we're going to be letting the oxygen in there. And as soon as that happens, especially if we're talking about a green plant, you're relying on that for all crazy sorts of minerals there. Or minerals, yes, but vitamins is the big deal. I was trying to spit out, sorry. As soon as we let oxygen in there, we're going to start degrading those vitamins. So the lesson there is as hay gets older, it's going to have less vitamins in it to use. Okay, mineral content. Here's your take home on that one. Mineral content is not something you can ever rely on out of a forage. I mean, it might be entirely different from a flake of hay that came 5 feet away in the field. There are some rough rules of thumb, and you can read through those, but if I were you, I'd tell you not to rely on mineral content out of forage. It's far too variable to hang your hat on at all. All right, that's it for this little slideshow. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to rearrange my screen, and we'll do another one. Okay, I'm going to try sneaking through this one kind of fast as I can. It is starting to get a little bit repetitive, but this is important stuff. So the nutritive value of it. So the first couple of rules of thumb is really, this might blow some of you away. Really young, immature forage is like 90% water. I mean, it is literally almost standing water out in a field there. And here is a rule of thumb that you can kind of stick to, is that as a plant matures, the amount of water that you're going to find in it is going to decrease as it matures. Also, nobody should be blown away because you go out, on the 1st of October and you look at a pasture and you're like, well, it's all dead, dry, and brown, and you'd be correct. It had dried out, and the water value of it has kind of gone away. So when we talk about weather, as things get really, really hot, like it does in the summer around here, we start seeing these huge changes in the moisture content of feed. Just to put this in perspective for you a little bit, you can go out, and it is not hard at all to go cut alfalfa hay if you're really cutting it, good and early before it gets too much bloom on it or too much maturity. Alfalfa hay, when you actually go out there with a swather, is going to be 75% water and 25% crude protein. Excuse me, I do need to specify. On a dry matter basis, if we removed all the water, then ran the test for crude protein, we're going to find we might get hay up to like 25% protein. The digestibility of it is going to be somewhere between 70 and 80%. It's just crazy high. And that's if you did it at the pre-bloom stage. If you waited for that alfalfa to get a little bit of bloom out there or start showing some purple to you, you'd go out there with a swather and cut it and find that it's only 40% water. By the way, that 40% is kind of a cool number to remember. That's what the moisture content has to be for a plant to continue its normal cell respiration. If you get below 40% moisture, that plant's effectively dead at that point. So just remember that one. It'll come up again. So yeah, just going from pre-bloom to a little bit of bloom, now all of a sudden, on a dry matter basis, our protein goes down to 12.4%. That is half. And the digestibility went from in the 70s or deep into the 80s down to 50 or 60%. We see the same things with grass. If you're going to go out and cut some pretty immature grass, it'd go from 19.5% protein clear down to 7.4, more than half. So we just lost protein hand over fist there. That change, when a plant decides it's time to be mature and go ahead and start being reproductive, it does not mess around. This change happens at about 1% a day. So I ask you that question at the bottom, what is this telling you as a manager? Well, if you're putting up hay, you better get out there and get it mowed on time, or you start losing forage quality in a hurry. This is a big deal. And everybody's sitting there going, great, that's exactly what I wanted to be looking at. So what can you learn from that right there? The point is that manure that starts stacking up, and I know everybody's going to accuse me of spending way too much time looking at cow shit, but I do, guilty. So there is a bunch to be learned from what the feces looks like. So this next picture might actually draw a little bit better circle around it. Can anybody tell me what the difference is they see between these two things? So the point I'm getting at is that everybody kind of sees that on this green grass, I've got a very different consistency of the manure patty. That one might have gone thunk, and that one might have made a little bit of a thunk when it hit, and that's going to be more of a splat. The point I'm trying to get at is higher protein absolutely has the effect of increasing the rate of passage through the gut. And it's kind of an interesting process how that happens. So you start giving those rumen microorganisms more nitrogen, and there is a direct analogy to draw here. It's the exact same thing as fertilizing a field. A large part of what that nitrogen that I threw out in a field is going to do isn't actually feeding the plant itself. It's feeding all the soil microbes. And those soil microbes unlock just a world more of nitrogen to use. So if I give more nitrogen to those gut bugs, it's like giving them a triple shot of Red Bull. They start doing their work a lot faster, and they can actually start creating a bunch more cellulase, and things just pick up and start going faster the more protein that you shove in that gut. And when that happens, we start seeing the transit time from the moment when a critter eats something to when it lands in when what's left over lands in a cow patty out the back end. So make no mistake, part of that is because things are moving so much faster. The large intestine just doesn't have time to pull as much water out of the feces. So that's definitely a huge part of the difference between the two. But the increased rate of passage also makes a very, very different consistency of that cow patty. The other thing is if I flip back to this picture, and we actually measured what was in there, and we did the exact same test that we do on a feed test there, we're going to find out that there's huge amounts of just these heavy-duty fiber molecules in there. And in point of fact, you're going to find lignin too. And it's just indigestible. Even though a ruminant's supposed to be able to deal with cellulose and fiber, this stuff has just gone around the bend so far that we can't digest it. You're not going to find it in here. There's no structure to it. Okay. Yeah, higher crude protein will most of the time come in combination with a feed that's lower in fiber. That makes a whole lot of sense, right? So if I'm putting something in front of them that has very high protein scores, I can make an inference that is probably pretty high energy and soluble energy at that, which points the finger directly away from, those heavy-duty fibers. So higher digestibility and faster passage rates makes for a splat rather than a thunk. So the take-home there is, if you start tripping over cow shit out in the field, you might want to think about supplementing a little bit of protein. Yeah, there you go. You heard a little bit about this one, fertilizing pasture and hay ground. We'll just kind of skip over that with the exception of the very last bullet point where it says fertilization is going to hasten maturity. I said it the exact same way, just the opposite, from the opposite direction. Said when we fertilize pasture quite a bit, we see less of those soluble sugars. Well, our measure of maturity is how much carbohydrate there is there in the form of a fiber versus a sugar or starch. So fertilizer will hasten maturity on a plant. I'm going to go through this super quick. If we're talking about grazing systems here. Okay, so look at these pictures side by side. What are the differences that you see there? So obviously you're going to tell me maturity of plants, but I'm going to kind of argue there isn't a whole bunch of difference in maturity in these plants. These have just dried out, but I'm seeing seed heads and stuff out there. So we're dealing with full onset of maturity. What I'm trying to bring into focus here is that if I take away a plant's ability to be undergoing any reproductive stuff, I make that plant get all mad at me and start growing again. And when you're a grazer, that is a very good thing, because as soon as a plant quits growing, we've lost all that crazy cool nutrition out of it. So a lot of grazing schemes are built around trying to take control of how mature we let a plant get. And the idea is I always want to come back and graze a plant before it goes on into full-on maturity. So yeah, you heard me make the comment before, we want to keep our grass green, short, and growing. That's why right there. Don't go too far with that comment. We also need to make sure we're following sound grazing principles inside of that, but that's a discussion for a different class. All right, I took 3 minutes more of your time than I needed to. I will have a short one again tomorrow, and then we are back in a classroom. Thank you, folks.